Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Right.
So I want you to imagine handing a blank piece of parchment to a 20-something kid. And this kid just inherited a fractured, complicated, and, incredibly fragile empire.
Oh, man. Yeah, no pressure.
Right, zero pressure.
Yeah.
And you hand him this parchment and say, write down whatever you want, any single thing, and it's yours.
Just a total blank check.
Exactly, a literal blank check. What would he ask for? Because the answer to that specific question didn't just build the most expensive, staggering architectural wonder in the ancient world. It actually set a psychological blueprint.
Yeah, a blueprint for how human beings either survive massive success or are just entirely destroyed by it.
Exactly. And that's what we're jumping into today. We are taking a deep dive into the first 9 chapters of 2nd Chronicles. And our mission here isn't just to, recite ancient history.
Right. Nobody wants a dry history lecture.
No, definitely not. We want to act as guides here. We're looking at what these ancient sources say to extract real, practical wisdom, moral insight, and life application for you, the 21st century listener.
Which is so needed right now because this text is just... it is the ultimate pressure test of human character.
It really is.
And what makes it so fascinating is that we aren't just looking at this event as some isolated historical anecdote. The text we are diving into today, it isn't just a ledger of ancient events. It is highly curated.
Right. It's intentional.
Deeply intentional.
Yeah.
To understand it, we have to look at the historical context. So we're stepping into what is widely considered the absolute golden age of ancient Israel.
King David has passed away, right?
Yes. His son, Solomon, is stepping up to consolidate power. The nation is wealthy, it's at peace, and it's standing at this massive turning point. But before we look at what Solomon actually writes on that blank parchment, we really have to look at who is telling us this story.
Because the author, the guy we usually just call the chronicler, he isn't sitting in a lush palace writing this down while Solomon is on the throne.
Oh, far from it. Not at all. The audience reading this original text is living in a completely different reality. The chronicler is writing to a post-exilic community.
Post-exile, so meaning they've already been conquered.
Exactly. To really grasp this, you have to put yourself in the dirt and the despair of their situation. These are people who have already lost everything. Everything.
Right.
They lived through the brutal siege and destruction of Jerusalem. They literally watched their national identity burn to the ground.
Wow.
And then they were dragged away as captives, forced into exile in Babylon for decades. And now, finally, this fragile, traumatized remnant has returned to a ruined land.
So they are essentially sitting in the rubble of what used to be a glorious nation.
Yeah, just scorched stones and weeds.
I try to picture what that return must have felt like. You grow up hearing these incredible stories from your grandparents about a city paved with wealth, a temple covered in gold.
A society that was the envy of the known world.
Right. And then you finally arrive, and it's just ruins. The psychological devastation of that gap between the memory and the reality, it must have been paralyzing.
Completely paralyzing.
Yeah.
And that psychological devastation is exactly why the chronicler is writing. He isn't giving them a dry history lesson. He is trying to remind a broken people of their highest spiritual ideals.
He's pointing them back.
Yeah, he points them back to this specific peak moment, Solomon's reign and the building of the great temple. He's saying, look, this is who we are at our best. This is the structural foundation for our relationship with the divine.
I think of it kind of like an architectural render. If your house burns down, you don't want a photograph of the charred remains.
No, definitely not.
And you don't even necessarily want a photograph of the house right before it burned, complete with the cracked driveway and the peeling paint,
Right, you want the original blueprints.
Exactly, because blueprints don't show the water damage or the everyday wear and tear. They show the design's perfect intention. They show that the structure was supposed to be.
That is exactly what the chronicler is doing here. He is handing them the blueprints of their own highest potential. And the very first page of that blueprint starts with an event that really defines Solomon's entire legacy.
Okay, so let's get into chapter 1.
So chapter 1 opens with Solomon firmly establishing his rule. But he doesn't start with a military parade, which is what you'd expect.
Right, a show of force.
Exactly. Instead, he gathers the captains, the judges, the governors, the entire leadership structure of his Israel, and they all go to the high place at a town called Gibeon.
To offer sacrifices, but not just a few.
No, The text says he offers 1,000 burnt offerings on the bronze altar.
Okay, we really have to pause and consider the sheer logistical reality of that.
1,000?
And animals.
It's massive.
We are talking about days, maybe weeks of continuous activity, the noise, the heat, the sheer volume of resources required for this public festivity.
Right, it's not a weekend barbecue.
No, it's a staggering public declaration of priorities.
And the location matters deeply, too.
Yeah.
David, his father, had brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and set up a tent for it there. But Solomon goes to Gibeon.
Why Gibeon?
Because that is where the original tabernacle of Moses was located. That is where the ancient bronze altar, the one constructed in the wilderness generations ago, was resting.
Ah, okay.
So Solomon is connecting his new administration to the deepest, most ancient roots of their faith. He is showing immense respect to the foundational tools of their worship.
He is basically taking this massive inheritance his father left him, the flocks, the herds, the wealth, and giving the very first and best of it back to the divine.
Yeah, he is sowing plentifully.
But the real turning point happens that night. After this massive, exhausting public display, God appears to Solomon in a dream and offers him that blank check we talked about.
Right.
God simply says, "Ask what I shall give thee."
Which brings us right back to the pressure test. A human being's deepest character is always revealed by their unfiltered desires. God wasn't just offering a gift here.
It was a test.
Exactly. God was testing Solomon to see what was truly taking up space in his heart. Was he a leader who viewed his position as an opportunity for personal enrichment? Or did he view it as a profound, terrifying responsibility?
Because if we're honest, if any of us are handed an absolute guarantee of one request, we claim we'd ask for noble things.
Oh, of course we do.
We'd say we'd ask for world peace or a cure for disease. But under the actual pressure of the moment, the human default is immediate comfort.
Completely.
We'd ask for our mortgage to disappear. We'd ask for an immense promotion, or honestly, for the people who annoy us to just go away. We ask for the burden to be lifted.
We want the work done for us.
No.
But look at what Solomon asks for. He doesn't ask for the burden to be lifted. He says essentially, "You have shown great mercy to my father David and made me king in his place. Now let your promise be established."
And then he makes the request.
Right. He says, "Give me wisdom and knowledge that I may go out and come in before this people. For who can judge this of thy people that is so great?"
He asks for the tools to do the hard work.
Exactly.
He asks for the capacity to handle the weight. It's an incredible admission of inadequacy, really.
It is.
He looks at the size of the nation, the complexity of the geopolitics, the sheer volume of human need he is now responsible for, and he realizes that his own intellect is entirely insufficient. He needs a capacity upgrade.
He does. And the response he gets is the hinge upon which this entire era of prosperity swings. Because Solomon didn't ask for riches, wealth, honor, or the destruction of his enemies.
Which would be the standard requests for any ancient Near Eastern monarch.
Right, standard operating procedure. But because he didn't ask for those things, God grants him the wisdom and knowledge he requested. And then God adds unprecedented wealth, possessions, and honor right on top of it.
There is a really profound paradox there.
Yeah.
Well, by not pursuing the material things, by prioritizing character and the capacity to serve, he ends up receiving the material things anyway.
Yeah, that's true.
It completely challenges our 21st century obsession with accumulating the what. We spend our entire lives chasing the wealth, the status, the followers, the external markers of success. We want the gold.
We want the finish line without the race.
Exactly. But Solomon focused entirely on the how, the wisdom to manage the responsibility.
Matthew Henry, in his commentary on this, points out that it's the difference between seeking the fruit and seeking the root. If you have the root, the wisdom, the discernment, the character of the fruit naturally follows.
But if you only chase the fruit, you eventually starve.
Right. However, there is a really fascinating editorial choice here in how the Chronicler records this interaction compared to other historical accounts we have, like the Book of Kings.
Oh, right. The curation, the blueprint analogy in action.
Exactly. In the parallel account of the Book of Kings, God promises Solomon all this wealth and honor, but adds a condition regarding a long life. Yeah, God says, "And if you will walk in my ways, then I will lengthen your days." The Chronicler completely omits that condition. He leaves out the promise of long life entirely.
Why leave out a detail like that? Is he just trying to save parchment?
Not at all. The Chronicler knows the end of the story. Historically, Solomon's later years were deeply problematic, and he did not fulfill those conditions for a perfectly sustained long life of obedience.
I see.
The chronicler, writing to this traumatized post-exilic audience, is carefully editing the narrative. He isn't interested in the way Solomon failed the conditions. He's interested in establishing the perfect template of what it looks like when a human being chooses wisdom over wealth.
He is showing them the ideal.
He's giving them the pure blueprint.
And that blueprint leads to a very specific, practical question for you, the listener, right now. If you are handed a blank check for your life today, no limits, no conditions, what would your immediate gut reaction request reveal about you?
That's a tough one.
Right. Are you constantly asking the universe or God or your circumstances to remove your burdens? Or are you asking for the wisdom and the capacity to carry those burdens well?
It is a question that requires really deep self-awareness. And what we see next is that Solomon doesn't just sit around philosophizing with this newly granted wisdom.
No, he gets to work.
Because wisdom, in the ancient Near Eastern context, isn't just about thinking deep thoughts. It is incredibly practical. It organizes, it strategizes, it builds things.
Which brings us to the next massive phase of his reign, spanning chapters 2 through 4. Solomon immediately directs his energy and his newly acquired resources toward the great task he inherited from his father.
Building the temple.
Right. And the scale of this project is truly difficult to wrap our modern minds around. He isn't just throwing up a shrine in the backyard.
No, he is organizing a continental supply chain.
He determines to build a house for the name of the Lord and a royal palace for himself. But he quickly realizes that while Israel has wealth and manpower, they lack specific technical expertise.
And high-end materials.
Exactly. So he engages in international diplomacy. He reaches out to Huram, sometimes known as Hiram in other texts, who is the king of Tyre.
Now, Tyre is a Phoenician city-state. They are Gentiles. They are not part of the Israelite covenant at all, but they are a maritime superpower.
They were the masters of the Mediterranean trade routes.
Right. They were famous for their heavily fortified island city, their highly skilled artisans, and their exclusive access to incredibly valuable resources.
Like the cedar trees.
Specifically, the massive cedar trees of Lebanon and the famous Tyrian purple dye.
Wait, I read about this. That dye was extracted from sea snails, right?
Yes, from the Murex sea snail. It took thousands of snails to make just a tiny amount of dye, which is why it was worth more than its weight in gold.
That is wild. So Solomon sends a message to King Hiram, essentially proposing a massive trade agreement. He asks for a master craftsman who knows how to work in gold, silver, bronze, iron, and these beautiful dyed fabrics.
And he also asks for cedar, cypress, and algum trees to be cut down in Lebanon.
And in exchange, Solomon promises an astronomical payment to Hiram's loggers and workers. He promises 20,000 measures of beaten wheat, 20,000 measures of barley, 20,000 baths of wine, and 20,000 baths of oil.
To put those numbers into perspective, a bath is roughly 5.5 gallons.
Okay.
So Solomon is offering over 100,000 gallons of wine and another 100,000 gallons of oil. The grain measurements equate to thousands of metric tons.
Unbelievable.
This isn't a simple barter. This is a massive multi-year international supply contract that would require fleets of ships and thousands of caravans to transport.
I mean, the logistics of floating massive cedar logs down the Mediterranean coast from Lebanon to Joppa and then somehow hauling them over the mountains to Jerusalem, it's an engineering marvel before the building even begins.
It really is.
But what I find even more fascinating is the diplomatic response from King Hiram. This Gentile king writes back to Solomon and actually blesses the God of Israel.
He does. Huram writes, "Because the Lord loves his people, he has made you king over them." And he goes on to bless the Lord, acknowledging him as the creator of heaven and earth who gave David a wise son.
Now, in the ancient Near East, neighboring sovereigns would often adopt the diplomatic language of the nation they were dealing with, right? Acknowledging the local deity as a powerful force.
Yes, that was common. But it speaks volumes about Israel's geopolitical standing at this moment, that the king of Tyre is so deferential and cooperative.
And Hiram makes good on the deal. He sends a master craftsman named Hiram Abi. And there's a beautiful little detail here. Hiram Abi's mother was an Israelite from the tribe of Dan, but his father was a man of Tyre.
So you have this literal blending of Jewish heritage and Gentile technical mastery coming together to build the Holy Temple.
It highlights a profound truth, I think. Building something of transcendent value often requires resources, skills, and perspectives from outside your own immediate community.
Solomon's wisdom allowed him to recognize what his nation lacked and to humbly ask for help from a foreign power.
But speaking of humility, there is a line in Solomon's initial letter to King Hiram that is, frankly, Shocking. It's in chapter 2, verse 6.
I know exactly the verse you mean.
Solomon is setting up this massive construction project, but he writes to Hiram, "But who is able to build him a house, seeing the heaven and heaven of heavens cannot contain him? Who am I then, that I should build him a house, save only to burn sacrifice before him?"
It is a moment of startling theological clarity. In the ancient world, temples were typically viewed as the literal dwelling places of the gods.
Right. You built a house so your god would live there, protect your city, and be contained within your borders.
You put the god in the box so you can manage them.
Exactly. But Solomon is about to spend an absurd amount of money and manpower, and he openly admits, look, I know God doesn't actually fit in this building. I'm not putting God in a box.
Yeah.
If he knows God can't be contained by the heaven of heavens, why build this incredibly expensive temple at all?
Matthew Henry has great insight on this. He points out that the temple isn't meant to limit God. It is an architecture of accommodation for human limitations.
Ah, human limitations.
Right. God does not need a physical house. But human beings are bound by space, by time, by geography, and by sensory experience. We need a physical place to anchor our attention.
That makes a lot of sense.
We need a location to direct our focus, a place where the community can gather, where the sacrifices can be physically managed. The temple is built for human benefit, to give them a tangible connection point to an intangible, infinite reality.
The physical space is a tool for human focus. I love that. But if we are talking about the human element, we absolutely must confront the most uncomfortable truth of this entire construction project.
Yes.
The labor. The text gives us the labor breakdown. Solomon counted out 70,000 men to carry burdens, 80,000 men to quarry stone in the mountains, and 3,600 overseers to manage them.
It's a massive workforce.
And in verse 17, the text explicitly clarifies who these 153,600 people were. They were the strangers in the land, the non-Israelite populations, the descendants of the Canaanites.
They were conscripted. It was forced labor.
Okay, I have to push back hard on this because as a modern reader, I hit that detail and everything just grinds to a halt.
Understandably so.
We are supposed to be looking at this building as the ultimate blueprint for spiritual ideals. We are talking about the highest aspirations of a nation. But if the physical foundation of this holy building is systemic oppression and forced labor, doesn't that inherently poison the spiritual ideal itself?
That's a heavy question.
I mean, how did the post-exilic audience, who had just spent decades as forced laborers themselves in Babylon, read this without wanting to throw the scroll across the room?
That is the essential friction of reading ancient texts, and it requires profound discernment. If we try to sanitize this, we lose the truth of the human condition.
Right.
The post-exilic audience would have understood exactly what conscripted labor meant. They lived it. But they also lived in an ancient Near Eastern reality where empire building, monumental architecture, and forced labor were inextricably linked.
Every great monument of the ancient world was built this way.
Exactly. From the pyramids to the Great Walls.
But doesn't that make it worse? That Israel was just acting like every other brutal empire?
It makes it real. The biblical narrative is not a sanitized fairy tale. It records human civilization in all its flawed, messy, and often brutal reality. Solomon was a king operating with the geopolitical tools of his era.
We don't read this text today and conclude that God endorses forced labor.
No, absolutely not. What the text forces us to confront is the deeply uncomfortable reality that humanity's highest spiritual aspirations are almost always tangled up with systemic human flaws.
It's the muddy waters of history. The architecture may be divine in its inspiration, but the execution relies on flawed, compromised human systems.
Perfectly said.
We can extract the enduring spiritual wisdom, the intent of consecrating our best efforts and highest resources to our ultimate ideals without blindly endorsing the socio-political methods of the Iron Age.
Exactly. And the sheer scale of those resources consecrated to this ideal is mind-boggling once we move into chapters 3 and 4.
Right, let's look at the actual building.
They build the temple on Mount Moriah, the exact location where God had appeared to David at the threshing floor of Ornan.
Now, the dimensions of the main structure aren't actually that massive by modern standards. It's about 90 feet long and 30 feet wide.
Like a moderate-sized modern house.
Yeah, but it's the interior design that is staggering. The text describes an absolute overload of precious metals. He overlays the inside with pure gold, specifically gold from Parvim, decorated with precious stones.
And inside the most holy place, he carves two massive cherubim, these Andriac figures. Their combined wingspan covers the entire 30-foot width of the room.
And they are entirely overlaid with gold.
The visual impact of walking into a room, illuminated only by limited light reflecting off solid gold surfaces, it would be overwhelming. It was designed to induce awe.
But there is a very deliberate gradation of materials, isn't there? The inside is pure gold, but as you move outward, the materials change.
Yes, very intentionally.
Outside the temple proper, he builds 2 massive bronze pillars, naming them Gachin and Boaz. And he constructs a bronze altar for the sacrifices that is 30 feet square and 15 feet tall. Why the shift from gold to bronze?
It's an architectural representation of holiness and proximity. Bronze is durable. It can withstand the extreme heat of the continuous sacrificial fires, and it represents the outer courtyard.
The place of human intersection, blood, and physical reality.
Exactly. As you move inward, closer to the symbolic presence of the divine in the most holy place, the materials become softer, rarer, and more precious. Gold doesn't tarnish.
It represents the incorruptible, eternal nature of the divine.
Precisely. The mechanics of the symbolism are incredible.
And speaking of mechanics, we have to talk about the molten sea.
Oh, the great bronze basin.
Yes, it's this massive cast bronze basin, 15 feet across, and it sits entirely on the backs of 12 cast bronze oxen.
3 facing north, 3 west, 3 south, 3 east.
Right. And it holds 3,000 baths of water, which is nearly 17,000 gallons. The engineering required to cast a single bronze object of that size in antiquity is a marvel.
It truly is.
But beyond the engineering, what is the point of a 17,000-gallon basin of water sitting on bronze cattle?
The molten sea was primarily used for the priests to wash themselves before they performed their duties. The imagery is deeply significant. The 12 oxen represent the 12 tribes of Israel, bearing the weight of the water of purification.
Oh, wow.
The underlying logic is that you cannot approach the sacred, you cannot minister to the divine while clinging to the dirt and corruption of your daily life. It represents the necessity of continuous, deep spiritual cleansing.
And the master craftsman, Huramabi, doesn't stop there. He makes pots, shovels, basins, flesh hooks, lampstands, tables, all of purest gold and bright bronze. The text notes that Solomon made so many bronze vessels that the weight of the bronze couldn't even be determined.
They literally stopped weighing it.
It is a masterclass in entirely resourcing a vision. He holds nothing back. Every detail, from the massive pillars down to the smallest golden lamp snuffer, is executed with maximum effort and the highest quality materials available.
Which provides a very pointed reflection for us.
How so?
Well, we are all building something with our lives. It might be a career, a family, a community organization, or our own internal character. But look at where you spend your primary resources, your time, your disposable income, your creative energy, your mental bandwidth.
Does the architecture of your daily life reflect your highest stated values?
Exactly. Are you dedicating your gold to the things you claim matter most, or is your energy just going toward personal comfort and distraction? Are you actually building a temple, or are you just hoarding the bronze?
That tension of intention versus action leads us perfectly into Chapter 5. Because as stunning as this building is, with its gold and its 17,000-gallon bronze seas, a physical structure is ultimately just a shell until it is infused with purpose.
Right.
Chapter 5 is where we transition from the physical construction of a building to the spiritual activation of a temple.
The project is finished. All the dedicated silver and gold are brought in. But to actually turn this building into the center of Israelite worship, they need the core component.
The Ark.
So Solomon assembles all the elders and the heads of the tribes to bring the Ark of the Covenant out of the city of David and up the hill to the new temple.
The Ark is the absolute epicenter of their faith. It is a golden chest containing the 2 stone tablets of the law that Moses received at Mount Sinai. It is the tangible symbol of the covenant, the agreement between God and Israel.
Bringing it into the newly constructed most holy place is the final, ultimate act of dedication.
The Levite priests carry it in and place it precisely underneath the expansive golden wings of the cherubim.
The text mentions that as they are moving the ark, they are sacrificing sheep and cattle in such massive numbers that they couldn't be counted. But the true climax of this chapter, the moment everything changes, isn't the animal sacrifices.
It's the music.
Yeah. The acoustic environment of this moment must have been earth-shattering.
Oh, absolutely. The text details the setup. The Levites, who were singers from the ancient musical families of Asaph, Heman, and Jeduthun, are dressed in fine white linen. They were holding cymbals, stringed instruments, and harps, standing at the east end of the altar.
And standing right next to them are 120 priests, all blowing trumpets.
Have you ever stood near a single brass trumpet being played at full volume?
It can be deafening.
Now imagine 120 ancient trumpets combined with hundreds of singers and crashing cymbals, all echoing off the stone and bronze of an enclosed temple courtyard.
It would vibrate in your teeth. You would feel it in your bone marrow. But the critical detail isn't just the volume, it's the alignment.
What do you mean?
Verse 13 specifically notes that the trumpeters and the singers were as one to make one sound to be heard in praising and thanking the Lord.
They lift up their voices in total, perfect unison,
Singing a very specific ancient refrain. For he is good, for his mercy endureth forever. And at that exact moment of unified praise, the text says, a thick cloud fills the house.
the glory of the Lord, the physical manifestation of the divine presence.
The glory is so intense, so physically overwhelming that the priests literally cannot stand up to continue their work. They have to stop everything.
Now, the mechanics of when this happens are vital. The divine presence wasn't triggered when they were slaughtering the endless line of sacrifices. It wasn't triggered by the sheer weight of the gold.
The trigger was when they were singing praises in total unity.
Matthew Henry highlights this beautifully. Where there's profound unity of purpose, the blessing follows. They weren't asking for anything in that moment. They weren't lamenting. They were simply aligned in gratitude and praise.
And the response is this overwhelming cloud. I think about this like an acoustic phenomenon. Like resonance?
Yes. If you've ever been in a concert hall or a cathedral where an entire orchestra and choir hit the exact same resonant frequency, something shifts. It's not just loud anymore. It becomes a physical force.
You can feel the vibration in your chest cavity.
It feels like the air itself thickens. In this moment at the temple, the spiritual resonance of the people is so perfect, their unity of purpose is so completely aligned, that the physical world literally bends around it. The cloud descends.
But the cloud itself is a fascinating paradox. We often think of glory as a blinding light. But a cloud both reveals and conceals simultaneously.
Reveal and conceal.
It reveals the undeniable presence of God. The people know he is there, filling the space. But it actively conceals the dazzling, unbearable reality of the divine essence. It protects fragile human beings from being consumed by the overwhelming power of the infinite.
Like looking at a solar eclipse through a dark filter. You know the immense power of the sun is right there, but if you look at it without the filter, it will blind you permanently.
The cloud is a filter of grace. And how Solomon responds to this overwhelming moment brings us to chapter 6, which contains perhaps one of the most remarkable counterintuitive speeches in ancient literature.
It really is. The temple is filled with glory. The massive, decades-long construction project is a monumental success. The people are unified. The music is perfect.
If you are an ancient king, this is the moment you step up to the microphone, so to speak, and give a speech full of arrogant triumph. Look at what I built. Look at how powerful we are. Look at how God favors my administration.
But he doesn't do that.
Not at all. Solomon stands before the bronze altar. He has actually built a special bronze platform just for this moment. He stands on it in front of the entire assembly of Israel, and then he drops to his knees.
He spreads his hands out toward heaven, and he delivers a prayer that is essentially a masterclass in radical vulnerability and anticipating failure.
He begins beautifully, acknowledging God's faithfulness to his father David, and admitting again that the heaven of heavens cannot contain God, much less this physical house. But then the prayer shifts.
It turns into a highly specific, legally structured series of what-if scenarios.
And these aren't optimistic scenarios. He doesn't say, what if we conquer Egypt? He outlines practically every disaster that could possibly strike a civilization.
Yeah, he says, what if a man violently wrongs his neighbor? What if we go to war and we are completely routed and defeated by our enemies because we sinned?
What if there is a massive drought and the sky is shut up? What if there is famine, pestilence, crop blight, mildew, or a plague of locusts?
He is outlining the total collapse of the agricultural and social systems, and then he anticipates the ultimate unthinkable disaster for an ancient nation. What if you were angry with them and deliver them over to their enemies and they carry them away captive to a land far off?
Which we have to remember, to the post-exilic audience reading this centuries later, wasn't a hypothetical fear.
No, it was their actual lived trauma.
They had survived the famine, they had survived the siege, they had been carried away captive.
Exactly. The Chronicler is showing them that their deepest trauma was anticipated at the very moment of their greatest triumph. And in every single one of these catastrophic scenarios, Solomon prays the exact same core requests.
If they turn back, if they confess your name, if they pray toward this house, then hear from heaven and forgive.
I have to look at this from a practical modern leadership perspective.
Okay.
If I am the PR director for Solomon's administration, I am pulling my hair out during this speech.
Oh, absolutely.
Why on earth would you spend decades and untold fortunes building the most magnificent structure on the planet, only to use your grand dedication speech to talk about losing it all, to talk about the people sinning, the crops dying, and the entire nation being dragged away in chains?
Isn't that terrible messaging for your opening day?
From a modern political standpoint, it's terrible PR. Modern leaders only project strength and inevitable success. But from a standpoint of deep, enduring wisdom, it is brilliant.
Solomon is pre-installing a safety net.
He is wise enough to know human nature. He knows that prosperity breeds complacency. When things are going incredibly well, people forget their foundations. They drift. They become arrogant.
In fact, Solomon states this reality explicitly in chapter 6, verse 36. He says, "For there is no man which sinneth not."
That is such raw realism. There is no man who doesn't sin.
He completely dismisses the idea of sinless perfection. He knows that failure is not just a possibility, it is an absolute inevitability. The system will fail because the humans running it are flawed.
So he is building a spiritual infrastructure that anticipates that failure.
Yeah.
He is making sure that when the people inevitably hit rock bottom, they already know the exact pathway back up. He is giving them the coordinates for grace before they even get lost.
And there is another detail in this prayer that is incredibly radical for the ancient world. In verses 32 and 33, amidst all this talk about the nation of Israel, he suddenly pivots and talks about the stranger.
The foreigner who is not an Israelite.
Right. He prays that if a foreigner comes from a far country because they've heard of God's great name and they pray toward this temple, that God will hear from heaven and do whatever the foreigner asks.
It is a radical vision of inclusion. Solomon is declaring that this magnificent house isn't just a private, exclusive club for Israel. It is meant to be a beacon for all people of the earth to know the divine name.
He is asking for an equality of access. If a foreigner seeks the truth, they should have the exact same privilege of being heard as a native-born Israelite.
Let's translate this entire concept into our modern reality. We live in a 21st century culture that aggressively oscillates between toxic perfectionism and an unforgiving cancel culture.
We expect our leaders, our companies, our partners, and ourselves to never make a mistake.
And when a mistake is inevitably made, the default societal reaction is immediate exile. You are cut off. We rarely build systems in our own lives or our organizations that account for our inevitable moral or practical collapses.
We build entirely for success.
We engineer for the best-case scenario, but we don't plan for the structural failure of our own character.
Right. But Solomon's prayer is a blueprint for profound resilience. He is saying, expect failure, own it when it happens, and build the pathway back to reconciliation before the disaster strikes.
So here is a reflection for you, the listener, to mull over.
When you inevitably fail in your marriage, in your parenting, in your career, in your ethics, do you have a pre-built pathway back to reconciliation? Do you know how to apologize and pivot? Or do you let pride and shame isolate you and keep you locked in your own personal exile?
Taking ownership of our failures requires deep humility. And that humility is the exact pivot point for Section 5 of our deep dive, where we move into Chapter 7 and see God's response to this massive, vulnerable prayer.
Yes, the famous "if my people" clause. Solomon finishes praying, and the response is immediate and visceral. Fire comes down from heaven and consumes the burnt offerings and sacrifices on the altar.
The glory of the Lord fills the house again, so much so the priests can't even enter. The people fall on their faces on the stone pavement, worshiping and praising.
They then hold a massive, joyful festival for 2 solid weeks. But the real substantive answer to the prayer comes later, in private.
Once the crowds are gone and the festival is over, the Lord appears to Solomon by night. And God gives an answer that introduces a challenging but absolutely vital concept: conditionality.
Conditionality.
God says, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself. He confirms that if the disasters Solomon listed do happen, if the sky is shut up, if locusts devour the land, if pestilence strikes, there is a specific, rigorous formula for restoration.
This brings us to 2 Chronicles 7.12, which is arguably one of the most quoted verses in the entire text.
Annoying.
God says, "If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land."
We really have to unpack the progression there.
Yeah.
Because it is incredibly specific. It's not a magical incantation where you just say, I'm sorry, and the locusts disappear. It is a rigorous process of internal and external change.
It starts with humility. The psychological recognition that you are not the center of the universe, that your way has failed, and that you need help.
Then comes prayer, the actual vocalization of that need. Then seeking God's face, which implies desiring a restored relationship, not just asking for a quick bailout from the consequences.
And then comes the hardest part, and turn from their wicked ways.
Precisely. Feeling sorry is insufficient. Intellectual regret doesn't change the trajectory of a nation or a life. It requires actionable behavioral change.
You have to literally walk in a different direction.
You have to stop doing the thing that caused the rot in the first place. And if those conditions are met, there's a two-part promise. God will forgive their sin and heal their land.
The internal spiritual forgiveness paves the way for the external physical healing of the community.
But we absolutely cannot ignore the second half of God's response, because right after this beautiful, comforting promise of forgiveness, God delivers a terrifying, unblinking warning.
He says, "But if you turn away and forsake my statutes and go and serve other gods, then I will pluck them up by the roots out of my land which I have given them, and this house I will cast out of my sight, and I will make it a proverb and a byword among all nations."
He essentially promises that if they abandon the foundational covenant, he will personally oversee the destruction of the very temple he just filled with glory.
He says people will walk by the ruins of this magnificent building and ask, "Why did this happen?" And the answer will be, because they abandoned the Lord.
Okay, we have to pause here because this is a massive obstacle to growth for modern readers. Modern listeners often deeply resist this kind of transactional or punitive view of the divine.
The idea that if you do this bad thing, God will send a literal plague of locusts or a foreign army to burn your city feels archaic. It feels like a threatening, volatile deity holding a club over humanity's head.
How do we extract wisdom from this with discernment, without just dismissing it as ancient superstition?
This requires us to understand the ancient theological mindset. In the ancient Near East, national survival was viewed as deeply and inextricably tied to covenantal obedience.
They believed in a direct, immediate correlation between a nation's morality and its agricultural or military success.
Now, as modern people, we operate with a different understanding of natural systems. We shouldn't necessarily map ancient national judgments onto modern geopolitical or meteorological events.
If a devastating drought happens today, we look at climate change, atmospheric pressure, and resource management. We don't automatically assume a nation broke a commandment.
Right. We don't say a hurricane hit a specific coastal city because that city was inherently more sinful than a city inland. That kind of thinking can be incredibly toxic.
Exactly. However, the enduring wisdom beneath that ancient framework is the immutable spiritual and social law of cause and effect.
Cause and effect.
Arrogance, corruption, systemic injustice, and a turning away from foundational moral principles will ultimately rot any society from the inside out. When leaders and citizens forsake justice, mercy, and humility to serve other gods, which in our modern context might look like the gods of limitless profit, unbridled ego, or absolute political power, the structural integrity of that society inevitably collapses.
The temple of that culture, no matter how much gold is on the walls, becomes a ruin. God's warning here isn't just a petty threat. It is a statement of cold reality. Moral actions have systemic, unavoidable consequences.
That makes profound sense. It's less about a lightning bolt being thrown from the sky and more about the inevitable catastrophic collapse of a building that has allowed its foundation to rot away.
So having established this intense covenant of consequences, we move into the final phase of our text, chapters 8 and 9. This is the summit of success, and it represents the realization of everything promised back in chapter 1.
The wisdom and the wealth reach their absolute zenith. It is the peak of the golden age.
Solomon is incredibly busy. He is building store cities, chariot cities, and fortifying towns across the region. He expands his economic reach by partnering again with King Hiram to build a fleet of ships, sending them to Ophir to bring back hundreds of talents of gold.
And the compounding nature of this wealth is staggering. Chapter 9 casually mentions that the weight of gold that came to Solomon in one single year was 666 talents.
To help us visualize that, an ancient talent is roughly 75 pounds. So 666 talents is approximately 50,000 pounds. That is 25 tons of solid gold flowing into Jerusalem in a single year. The economic scale is almost unfathomable.
He has so much gold he doesn't even know what to do with it.
Yeah.
He makes 200 large shields out of beaten gold and 300 smaller shields just to hang in his palace.
He builds a massive throne out of ivory and overlays the entire thing with pure gold, with 12 carved lions standing on the 6 steps leading up to it. The text literally states silver was not considered valuable in the days of Solomon.
He made silver as common as the rocks on the ground in Jerusalem.
And this combination of unimaginable wealth and unparalleled administrative wisdom attracts global attention. It culminates in the famous visit of the Queen of Sheba.
She represents the universal human drive to seek out truth and verify greatness. She travels a massive distance, likely from modern-day Yemen or Ethiopia, with a huge caravan carrying spices, gold, and precious stones.
And she comes specifically to test Solomon with hard questions. She wants to know if the hype is real or if it's just good ancient PR.
And the text says Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was hidden from him. But it's not just his intellect that breaks her. When she sees the architecture of the house, the intricate food on his table, the organized seating of his servants, the majestic stairway leading to the temple, the sheer, staggering order of his administration, the text says there was no more spirit in her.
She is left breathless. She blesses God for putting Solomon on the throne to execute justice and righteousness.
It is the absolute pinnacle. The known world is coming to Jerusalem, bringing tribute, just to hear the wisdom that God put in Solomon's heart. He reigns over all the kings from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines.
But, well, we have to talk about the massive elephant in the room. If you know the broader biblical narrative, if you read the parallel historical account in the book of 1 Kings, you know this story of perfect success takes a very dark turn.
Yes, a tragic turn.
1 Kings explicitly tells us that Solomon's incredible wealth, his accumulation of thousands of horses from Egypt, and specifically his 700 foreign wives and 300 concubines, eventually led his heart away from God.
In his old age, this king who built the ultimate temple to the Lord starts building high places and shrines for the foreign gods of his wives.
Because of his heavy taxation and his idolatry, the kingdom fractures immediately after his death. But here is the shocker. 2 Chronicles completely omits this fall.
It does. It details all his wealth, and then it just says he reigned 40 years, slept with his fathers, and died.
Why? I mean, isn't that just objectively bad history? You can't just edit out the worst part of a leader's life?
It's not bad history. It is purposeful theology. Again, we have to remember the blueprint. The Chronicler is writing for the post-exilic community.
They already know about the fall.
They are literally living in the rubble caused by the sins of the kings. They don't need another depressing lecture on how bad things can get or how even the greatest men fail. They need a vision of what they are called to rebuild.
So the omission is a deliberate act of focus.
Absolutely. The historical record is fascinating because this silence is essentially an act of profound grace. When a society is trying to rebuild its identity, it needs an ideal to aim for.
The chronicler is choosing to define Solomon by his highest aspirations and his greatest, most enduring contribution, the building the temple and the establishment of wisdom, rather than by his inevitable human flaws.
He is painting a picture of the ideal kingdom to give them hope for the future.
But I want to push back on the wealth itself. Even if the chronicler gracefully omits the idolatry, he leaves in all the obsessive details about the gold, the shields, the ivory throne, and the massive stables of horses. And if we look back at the book of Deuteronomy, Moses explicitly warned future kings of Israel not to multiply horses, not to multiply wives, and not to greatly multiply silver and gold.
Moses basically said, when you get a king, don't let him do these three things.
And Solomon does exactly those three things to an extreme degree. How do we balance this absolute material excess with his supposed spiritual wisdom? Isn't the wealth itself the poison?
That is the profound, lingering tension of the text. The modern translation for us is that success can actually be significantly more dangerous than failure.
Think about it. When you are building something, a business, a career, a marriage, you usually rely heavily on wisdom, humility, and seeking good counsel. You know you need help.
But when you achieve massive success, when the gold starts flowing in, the accumulation of resources can subtly, almost imperceptibly, shift your reliance.
You stop relying on the wisdom that built your success, and you start relying on the wealth itself.
Exactly. You start trusting the 500 gold shields on your wall instead of the divine wisdom that gave you the capacity to make them.
Yeah.
You start trusting the horses and the chariots instead of the covenant.
Solomon's reign shows us what happens when humanity is given exactly what it asks for, and then some. It is glorious, it is beautiful, but it is deeply fragile.
The material excess, even though the chronicler doesn't focus on the negative consequences, serves as a subtle, glaring warning for the discerning reader. The resources are a blessing, but they carry the heavy seed of complacency.
So what does this all mean for us, the people listening to this ancient, highly curated, deeply muddy history? It means that building a life of wisdom is not a one-time choice.
You don't just ask for wisdom at the beginning of your journey, get your blank check, and then coast for 40 years. You have to actively maintain the humility that allowed you to ask for wisdom in the very first place.
And you must build systems of repentance. You must know that you will fail, that your resources will tempt you, and you must have the architecture of forgiveness ready and waiting.
I love that phrase, the architecture of forgiveness.
In this deep dive, we've covered the psychology of the blank check, the staggering logistics of a massive building project built by flawed human hands, the acoustic resonance of unified praise bringing down the glory of God, the safety net of anticipating our own failures, and the incredibly dangerous summit of ultimate success.
We've seen how the chronicler curated this history to give a broken, exiled people a vision of their highest possible selves.
And so I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you step back into your own reality today. The chronicler made a deliberate, graceful choice. He chose to define King Solomon by his highest aspirations and his greatest, most enduring contribution to the world, rather than by his inevitable, messy human flaws.
Think about your own life. What is the temple you're building with your limited time, your energy, and your resources? And when the history of your life is finally written, when your story is curated by those who remember you, will you have left behind something of such deep, enduring value that it completely outshines your imperfections?
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.